Good morning, everyone. My name is Trish Secca, and I'm a Senior Nutrition Program Manager here at IFNS. We're happy to have you here today and to offer you this webinar focused on dietary sweetness and body weight. What do we know and where do we go from here? For those of you that are new to IFNS, or the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences, we are a nonprofit organization that mobilizes government, industry, and academia to drive, fund, and lead actionable science in the areas of food safety and nutrition to advance public health. We catalyze the creation of scientific knowledge by funding external researchers and convene experts to support positive change. Our collaborative and inclusive structure empowers members to bring forward the diverse perspectives of the entire food and beverage ecosystem. Our core values are also illustrated on this slide, and they guide everything we do. Scientific integrity is centered on transparency, and we actively seek and enable collaborations, all for the benefit of public health. You can learn more about our organization at ifns.org. This webinar is brought to you by the IFNS Low and No Calorie Sweetener Committee, which seeks to develop and communicate the science related to how the consumption of low and no calorie sweeteners can contribute to overall health and wellness. This webinar falls under our focus area of the role of low and no calorie sweeteners in taste perception and food choices. Before we get started, I'd like to cover how to ask questions. This is the first format that attendees may see on their meeting interface. First, starting at the top, you'll see an orange arrow. This arrow allows you to expand or collapse the control window on your screen. When this window is expanded, you can type in your comments and questions. And in fact, we encourage you to participate this way in the dialogue. The questions you type are only visible to IFN staff and not other attendees. And some of you may see the second format on their screen. Again, we encourage you to submit questions at any time during the presentation, and IFN staff will ensure that questions from the audience are addressed with any remaining time at the end of the webinar. This webinar is also approved for 1 CPEU by the Commission on Dietetic Registration, and a link will be shared with participants after the webinar for you to access your certificate. With that, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Dr. Kelly Higgins. Dr. Higgins is a clinical nutrition research scientist at the USDA Agricultural Research Service Food Components and Health Laboratory in the Beltsville Human Nutrition Research Center. She received her food science doctoral degree and Master of Public Health from Purdue University and her dual bachelor's degrees in nutrition sciences and biochem from the University of Missouri. Dr. Higgins' current research investigates the effects of sensory properties and palatability of the diet on body composition and ingestive behavior. In this role, Dr. Higgins utilizes her skills to explore what people eat, how they eat it, and why they eat it. Dr. Higgins also previously worked as a senior scientist at Exponent, a scientific consulting company where she led systematic reviews on the health benefits of dietary exposures and conducted research to determine usual food and nutrient intakes and nutrient adequacies based on using NHANES data. Welcome, Dr. Higgins.
Thanks for that introduction, Trish. Let me share my screen. All right. I'm very excited to present for you today some of the recent work on dietary sweetness and body weight so that we can understand what we've done in the research field so far and where we can go from here. So I want to start off with what is sweetness. Sweetness is a basic taste that is perceived when compounds that are perceived to be sweet bind to the T1R2, T1R3 sweet taste receptor heterodimer. That's a scientific explanation. But you guys all understand sweetness as a sensation you've been experiencing all your life. Your experience to sweetness when you consumed breast milk or infant formula as an infant, when you were introduced to complementary foods, and you're exposed to it every day in the diet that you consume. So sweetness is a basic taste, and it's also innately liked. as you can see by the grin on my niece's face the first time that she tried sweet potatoes. The amount of sweetness in a food or beverage increases the palatability, at least to a certain level. So we understand that sweetness is a basic taste and is palatable. So because sources of sweetness in the diet are innately liked, it's relatively easy to consume excess energy from these sources. And if that increase in energy intake is maintained long-term, contributing to positive energy balance, it may have adverse effects on body weight. Because of this, there have been numerous dietary recommendations from governmental and public health organizations that recommend reducing intake of added sugars. Most of these recommendations, such as the recommendations for the dietary guidelines for Americans, focus on substituting either reduced or no sugar substitutes for full sugar products. Some organizations take this recommendation even further and actually recommend not only avoiding added sugars, but dietary sweetness. This is because of the hypothesis that exposure to sweetness leads to the development of a sweet preference, which you probably know colloquially as development of a sweet tooth. And because these foods that are sweet tend to be palatable, it could potentially lead to an increase in energy intake and again, body weight if maintained long term, which can have very negative consequences for body weight. But that's if this relationship does hold. So what we want to address today is these two sides of relationship. Does dietary exposure to sweetness lead to development of sweet preference? And does dietary exposure to sweetness lead to increases in energy intake and body weight? So to focus in on the first half of the equation, there has been a lot of research that has been completed and ongoing in this area. In a 2017 systematic review, they investigated the relationship to exposure to sweet foods and acceptance and preference for foods. They identified 21 studies, 7 cohorts, and 14 control trials, and they found that the evidence was very heterogeneous and that there was no clear association between exposure to sweetness and preference for sweetness. So that's just a systematic review of the studies to date. There are also 3 current ongoing clinical trials that are investigating whether exposure to sweetness from a variety of sources does influence sweet preference or perception. Kees de Graaf is going to go into a bit more detail about one of the specific studies that they are conducting at Wageningen University. But for my section of the presentation, I want to focus on that latter half of the association. Does dietary sweetness exposure contribute to body weight gain? Understanding this relationship has important implications for how we recommend strategies for body weight management. If exposure to sweetness has no effect on dietary preferences, then recommending a diet that an individual can comply with, independent of the level of sweetness, should be recommended to help facilitate body weight management. However, exposure to sweetness does in fact alter preferences, and individuals do have a higher preference for sweet foods, then strategy should be targeted at reducing the sweetness of the diet. So before any of these recommendations can be developed, it's important to understand what evidence is out there on the relationship between dietary sweetness and body weight. So we set out to conduct a scoping review and evidence map to determine what evidence is available on the relationship between dietary sweetness and body weight related outcomes in adults. This project was funded by the USDA with supplemental funding from IFANS. It was conducted by myself, by other collaborators at the USDA's Food Components and Health Lab, as well as Catherine Appleton. The primary aim of this review was to identify and map studies that investigated the association between total dietary sweetness and body weight related outcomes and/or energy intake among adults. We completed the following strategy in order to complete this project. We first conducted a systematic literature search to identify relevant publications. We then screened through those publications based on our inclusion-exclusion criteria, which I'll go into detail in just a second. The studies that were included based on those inclusion criteria were then categorized into a database that we have produced for open access use. And then all those studies were further categorized into a hierarchy based on key study characteristics to determine where evidence gaps exist. Those key characteristics were the type of sweetness exposure and the study design type. So we sought to identify studies that were conducted primarily among adults that were either generally healthy or had a disease prevalent among Western populations, such as type 2 diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia. Our primary interest was identifying studies that looked at total dietary sweetness, but we also wanted to capture studies that looked at some component of the diet that was sweet, so either intake of sweet foods and beverages or intake of total or added sugars or sweeteners. The comparator included in these studies needed to be of lower sweetness. So that means that we didn't capture studies that looked at iso-sweet comparison, so comparing either two sweeteners to each other or comparing to a other equal sweet control. The primary outcomes of interest were body weight and BMI, but we also captured studies looking at energy intake, fat mass, body fat percentage, waist circumference, or waist to hip ratio. We included observational studies, so that would include cross-sectional studies, longitudinal cohorts, and case control studies, as well as clinical trials, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses. While we included the systematic reviews in this evidence map, we did not evaluate them any further because each of these reviews answered a slightly different question related to sweetness, but not quite directly related to our particular question of interest. So I mentioned earlier that our primary interest was looking at sweetness of the entire diet. I want to make it clear that this is different than looking at just intake of individual sweet foods or beverages. The human diet is very complex and includes many foods and beverages with varying sensory properties consumed alone or in combination, which makes it very difficult to evaluate sweetness of the total diet. There are factors in the food matrix that make it so that just measuring the sugar concentration doesn't necessarily tell you how sweet a diet is. There are components of the food matrix that they can either sequester sweeteners, preventing them from binding to the sweet taste receptor. And there's also presence of compounds that can lead to the suppression of sweet taste perception, such as the presence of bitter compounds in food. So while sugar is correlated with sweetness intensity, there is still a lot of variability, making it really important to not just look at the amount of sugar or intake of specific sweet foods, but to look at the sweetness of the entire diet. So because of this, we categorized each of the studies based on their sweetness exposure into the following hierarchy. So first, we were looking at studies that looked at total dietary sweetness intake. So that's the sweetness of the entire diet. We next looked at foods and beverages that were typically considered to be sweet, either conventionally considered to be sweet or classified as sweet based on known sweetness databases. So these include things like sugar-sweetened beverages, cakes, candies, pies, other typically sweet foods and beverages. We also captured studies that looked at total or added sugar intake. We also captured studies that looked at sweetener intake. So this includes low-calorie sweeteners or sugar substitutes. And we also had a category that was other sweet intake. So these typically included foods that were conventionally to be considered sweet, but either contained other bioactives that could affect body weight, or were oral exposures that were sweet but were not swallowed. So we kind of created this bucket as a catch-all other sweet intake. So in our literature search, we identified over 36,000 publications. And when we screened through all those based on our inclusion-exclusion criteria, we identified 833 reports that reported on 804 individual studies. So like we said before, we captured the studies that were the systematic reviews, but didn't evaluate them further. And we also identified 92 publications that looked at dietary patterns that included sweet foods and beverages. These were typically defined by some sort of principal component analysis, but because of the way that these food patterns were described, it was very difficult to tell if the comparator diets were actually low sweet. So while they may be relevant studies related to sweetness, they have limitations and thus did not evaluate any further in the current review. So we took these 804 studies and then produced the following heat maps to get a lay of the land on what sorts of studies were out there that looked at various sweetness exposures, which you will see on the y-axis of each of the graphs, by study design type, which is going across the x-axis of the graphs for each of the outcomes of interest, either body weight and or BMI, energy intake, fat mass or body fat percentage, or waist circumference and or waist to hip ratio. So for this presentation, we're just going to focus in on the body weight and BMI outcomes, as well as the energy intake outcomes. So again, our primary interests were studies that looked at total dietary sweetness. And as you can see, with the lighter shades of the boxes indicating fewer studies and the darker shades indicating a larger number of studies, there are very few studies that actually looked at total dietary sweetness exposures. There are also very few studies that looked at sweet foods and beverages that measured the sweetness of the foods using some sort of sensory method. The majority of the evidence out there focuses in on intake of sweet foods and beverages that are assumed to be sweet, or studies that look at sugar intake. There are a few studies that looked at sweetener intake or other sweetness exposures, and the majority of the studies tend to be observational in nature, with the bulk of the evidence consisting of cross-sectional studies. We have a slightly different body of evidence that looked at energy intake outcomes. The key difference here is we do get a few more studies that look at total dietary sweetness and energy intake, or studies that looked at sweet foods and beverage intake and also measured the sweetness. However, these studies tend to be either cross-sectional or they were clinical trials that were less than or equal to 24 hours in duration. So relatively short studies, what makes it difficult to extrapolate evidence to predict body weight. So let's focus in on that primary outcome of total dietary sweetness exposure. We found 7 studies, which is less than 1% of the included studies in this evidence map, that looked at total dietary sweetness. This included 2 clinical trials, 4 cross-sectional studies, and 1 study of other design type. This study was a crowdsourced study that used MyFitnessPal data to categorize foods based on their sensory properties. And so we won't go into much more detail on that study. So I'll do well, the aim of our scoping review was to identify the number of studies. I want to go into a little bit of detail on what kind of outcomes were observed among the studies that did look at total dietary sweetness exposure. The first was a 24-week randomized control trials, which included a 24-week follow-up that compared a standard diet to a low fructose diet. Within the low fructose diet, they put specific emphasis on avoiding sweetened foods, sweetened dairy products, or sweetened foods labeled as diet, since those typically consume low-calorie sweeteners. They did not systematically measure the sweetness of the entire diet, so we're basing this just on what they recommended to those participants, which includes some assumptions about the sweetness of that diet. In this study, they found no difference in body weight or BMI between the standard diet and the low sweetness diet, but they did see a favorable change in waist circumference with the low fructose diet. The other clinical trial that was conducted that did look at total dietary sweetness was a 24-hour clinical trial that investigated the effect of a sweet diet, a savory diet, or a mixed diet on 24-hour energy intake. This clinical trial found that there was no effect of the sweetness properties of the food on energy intake over 24 hours. Among the four cross-sectional studies, these studies tended to go about evaluating total dietary sweeteners a bit more systematically. So in this particular study, they used 2-day, 24-hour food records from 2 study populations. They had a group of trained panelists evaluate the sweetness of 476 foods, and then use that data to extrapolate the sensory properties of the entire diet. This produced a sensory database that they could use to determine how the sensory properties of the diet were correlated with body weight status. And what you can see from this study is that foods that were classified as sweet, sour, or sweet fat were not associated with increases in body weight status, and in some cases were actually demonstrated the opposite relationship. That individuals that were normal weight actually consumed more energy from foods that were sweet, sour, or sweet fat than foods that were than individuals that were overweight or obese. Taste-O-Graph is going to go into a bit more detail about how these taste databases were developed. And for the sake of time, I'm going to go through and just let you know that the other 2 cross-sectional studies that looked at this relationship found very similar observations. That while exposure to sweetness was associated with energy intake, it was less so than foods that were considered to be salty or fatty. And another study found that there was no relationship between sweetness exposure from the diet and whether or not an individual was lean or obese. We found this was just our primary outcome. We found numerous other studies that looked at sweet food and beverage intake, a few of which actually did measure the sweetness exposure for individual foods and beverages. We found about 16% of our studies looked at total sugar intake, 32 studies looked at the association between sweetener intake and body weight related outcomes, and 127 studies looked at some other sweetness dietary exposure. So I've just given you a very top line look of what evidence we found that investigated the association between total dietary sweetness exposure and body weight related outcomes. We've included all of the data that you've seen in these heat maps from the individual studies are included in a access database that is available on OSF for open access use. There you can find all the individual studies as well as some of the top line characteristics of the studies, such as study design, duration, sample size, outcomes measured, and population characteristics such as age, body weight status, gender, and health status. So what gaps do we find? As I've mentioned, we found very few studies that actually looked at the association between total dietary sweetness and body weight related outcomes. The bulk of the evidence on intake is based on studies that looked at sugar, sweetener intake, or intake of individual sweet foods, making it so that you had to make assumptions about the rest of the diet assuming that those diets are higher sweet, even though they may or may not be. So despite popular belief, there is limited published evidence to date from investigations that determine whether there's an association between dietary sweetness and body weight. This lack of evidence may be due to the fact that it's very difficult to study the sweetness of the entire diet, because sweetness comes from a variety of sources. These sources are all found in foods at varying intensity levels. The components in the food matrix impact how these foods, the sweetness of these foods, are perceived. And then factors about how they're consumed also play into how sweetness is perceived from these diets. So we've just focused in on sweetness today, but sweetness is rarely consumed alone. It tends to be clustered with other sensory properties such as sour or fat. So maybe focusing in on just sweetness is looking too narrow. Maybe we need to focus in on more about the palatability of the diet if we want to see if there are any associations that exist. But based on the evidence we've seen, there's really limited evidence to draw any sort of recommendations about avoiding sweetness to help with body weight management. And with that, I will hand it over to Kees de Graaf so he can present on some of his work they've been doing on sweetness and body weight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Great presentation. So our next speaker, as Kelly mentioned, is Dr. Kees de Graaf. Dr. de Graaf has a chair in the Sensory Science and Eating Behavior at the Division of Human Nutrition and Health of Wageningen University in the period 2006 to 2021. Dr. de Graaf received his PhD on the taste perception of mixtures of sweet tasting compounds. Since then, he has worked on the meaning of sensory signals such as taste and particularly sweetness, odor, and texture for eating and nutrition behavior and the regulation of energy intake. He is the author or co-author on more than 300 papers, of which a large number of them deal with sweetness perception, sweetness preferences, and the impact of sweetness on caloric intake and nutritional issues. The mission of his work is to make the healthy choice the happy choice. Over to you, Dr. de Graaf.
Thank you, Trish. Yeah, and thanks also for Ivans to invite me to give a talk on sweetness. And I'm happy that you referred to my PhD thesis, which I started about 40 years ago on sweetness, and I'm still involved in this area. But I think now the area is much more exciting than it was then. And of course, there's a lot of societal debate about sweetness, and yeah, it's still a remarkable issue and important to study. Let me first discuss conflicts of interest. I've been around for a long time, and during that time I had multiple sponsors of both from the private sector, but also from the public sector, and also from NGOs, and also from the European Commission. So there's a lot of sponsors for my work in the past. I will talk now about the sweetness of diets in relation to weight status and sensory preferences. I start off with a short background, which is, I think, very similar to the excellent introduction of Kelly. Then I will talk about the measurement of sweetness exposure of whole diets, how we developed that. Then refer to a few studies that and actually Kelly also showed some data, but I will express them in a slightly different way, where we relate sweetness exposures to body weight. And then I'll give some details on the SWEET 2 study, which is an ongoing trial. And for me, it's a kind of the cherry on the pie of my whole career to study the long-term effect of dietary sweetness exposure on sweetness preferences. And then I'll have a short conclusion. But first, background, and this is very similar to what Kelly referred to. people love sweetness. I think people love sweetness all over the world. They get happy by it. And you saw the picture of Kelly's niece. Sweetness is a very pleasant sensation, and that has also led to the persuasive, I would say, societal narrative that if you are exposed to sweetness, then your sweetness preferences will increase. That will lead to a higher sugar and energy intake, and then you will get fat. When you talk about the nutritional recommendations or public health policies, say with respect to some nutrients, of course, then you need to measure the exposure to that nutrient. You need to measure, say, vitamin C levels or carbohydrate levels or fat, saturated fat levels, and then you need to define what is more healthy or not. So when you want to have a policy on sweetness, then of course, yeah, it's necessary that you quantify and measure the sweetness, not only of food products, but I think also when you have dietary recommendations, of course, then you have to measure the sweetness of the whole diet. If you are a good nutritionist or you want to have public health policies, then you need an indication of the sweetness of the whole diet. That's what we started about 6-7 years ago, where we developed a method to measure the sweetness exposure of the whole diet, and also including other tastes. And of course, you can answer the question, can we measure the sweetness of the diet? I think the answer to that is yes. You can train sensory panels to give reliable sweetness intensities for the same foods across the world. And about 6 years ago, we published a study where we trained a Dutch sensory panel and we trained a Malaysian sensory panel to assess the intensities of basic taste and fat sensation of commonly consumed foods in the Netherlands and also in Malaysia. What we also included was 19 identical foods, which were then evaluated by the Malaysian panel and by the Dutch panel. And in the lower right panel, you see the correlation between the sweetness intensities of the Dutch panel and the Malaysian panel. And what you can see that there's a R squared of about 0.96, indicating that the sweetness ratings of the Dutch panel and the sweetness ratings of the Malaysian panel give very similar values. There are other taste databases as well. We developed that in the Netherlands for about 470 foods. In Australia, Kelly also referred to that database. Lees and Conor de la Hunty, they developed a taste database. In France, the people from the Centre de Goût in Dijon developed a taste database in France, and we also did it in Malaysia. The study from the US, from Australia and in the Netherlands, we used single foods from fruit composition databases that were used in the National Food Consumption Survey, like comparable, I would say, to the NHANES in the USA. And what we did then, we selected a number of foods, commonly consumed foods by the Dutch Food Consumption Survey. And then that's a survey representative of the Dutch population of around 1,400 people. We selected all foods which were consumed at a frequency of more than 20%, referring to energy, macronutrients, and sodium. And then we selected about 470 Dutch foods, which contributed to about 83 of the total energy intake. And in Malaysia, we actually did the same, and in Australia, they also had a similar method. What we did, we assessed the taste intensities of these 470 foods in a reproducible way. And then you can have all types of measures on reproducibility. And we train the panel so that they give the same answer to the same foods on different occasions. Then we clustered those 470 foods into taste clusters by means of cluster analysis, and then you, in the Dutch situation, you get 6 clusters. One cluster sweet sour foods, sweet fatty foods, bitter foods, neutral tasting foods, bitter savory fatty foods, and foods with only a fat sensation. And what you can then do, you can calculate with the help of the food consumption survey the contribution of taste clusters to the overall energy intake. As an example of taste clusters, I've given a number of foods. Like for instance, apple belongs to the sweet sour category. It has a sweetness score of 22 and a sourness score of 40. Brown wheat bread has a neutral taste. It doesn't have a taste intensity of any strong intensity of any basic taste. Mayonnaise will not surprise you that it has a fatty taste or fat sensation. Coffee is bitter. Gouda cheese, and I couldn't live without it, is salt umami fatty. And chocolate bar is of course sweet fatty. So the whole food supply is divided into these taste clusters, and then you can calculate the contribution of these taste clusters to the total energy intake of a Dutch population. And I'll show you some of these data, which were in a slightly different form also shown by Kelly. Here you see the contribution of sweet tasting foods to the total energy intake as a function of weight status in women. And what you can see here in the Dutch National Food Consumption Survey, that the contribution of sweet tasting foods is slightly going down from normal weight people to overweight people to obese people. This was clear in the Dutch National Food Consumption Survey, but also in a parallel study which was focused on dietary assessment. And in the dietary assessment methodology study, they used dietary recalls, and they used also food frequency questionnaire. And the outcome of both methods, both the dietary recall and the food frequency questionnaire, yielded a similar result when it goes about sweet taste and obesity. This is the slide on men, where I also included not only sweet fat and sweet sour, but also salt umami fat. These are the same data as Kelly presented, and what you can see is that the contribution of sweet tasting foods goes down with increasing weight, but the intake of salty umami fatty foods goes up with increasing weight. So the issue may not be so much the sweet taste, but it may more be the salt umami tasting fatty tasting products. A very nice slide is was data set was looked at by Kieran Ford, my successor in Wageningen. He looked at data in Singapore, and he divided in a large Singaporean cohort. He also categorized all the tastes, and he divided the population in non-overweight and overweight people. And what you can see here is the energy intake and the weight intake in grams per day for the non-overweight and the overweight people. And in pink, you see the contribution of sweet tasting foods to the overall energy intake. What you can see is that it is lower than in the Netherlands, but here you also don't see that overweight people have a higher intake from sweet tasting foods. So I think that's very reinforcing, because it's a totally different population. It's a very large population, so I think it's a very valuable data set to reinforce that position. So I think the conclusion is very clear that a high sweetness intake does not necessarily lead to a high body weight. Finally, I would like to discuss the design of the sweet tooth study. That's an ongoing trial that we are now doing on the long-term effects of dietary sweetness exposure on sweetness preferences. And that's a trial to, I would say, get a good answer to a very basic question. And that is, does repeated exposure to sweetness lead to a higher sweetness preference? This is the sweet tooth study. The principal PhD fellow on this study who does most of the work is Eva Kat she's from Slovenia, and we collaborate with Catherine Appleton from Bournemouth and Monica Mars and Claudia Teng, who just graduated from Bournemouth. The study design is like this. We have a baseline measure, then we have a 6-month intervention period and a 4-month follow-up, where we have a high sweetness exposure group, a regular sweetness exposure group, and a low sweetness exposure group. So people are exposed for 6 months to either one of 3 conditions. We aim for a total population of 180 people, so that we have 60 people per group. Here you see the dietary intervention. In the low sweetness exposure group, 10 to 15% from the total energy intake comes from sweet tasting foods. In the regular exposure, sweetness exposure group, which is equivalent, I think, to the regular Dutch diet or average Dutch diet, 25 to 30% of the total energy comes from sweet tasting foods. And in the high sweetness exposure, it's 40 to 45% of the total energy comes from sweet tasting foods. And we base these percentages again on the taste database, where it makes you easy to calculate these contributions. This is also, I would say, advanced dietetics, which I couldn't do, but with the help of, I would say, wonderful staff in dietetics and very clever design of diets. What we managed is that we, despite the enormous differences in sweetness, the contribution of the macronutrients to the overall diets were very similar. I must also say that the intervention foods in the high sweetness, they of course were sweet foods. In the low sweetness, they were mainly savory foods. They are provided ad libitum, but the whole diets are comparable in macronutrient composition, which is, I think, a very, very difficult. Well, different foods. We distribute the foods to the people at home, which was actually an asset when we continued during the COVID pandemic, and then we could serve the foods at the people at home, where we brought them foods for 2 weeks. The primary outcome measure is the change in taste preferences of sweet foods. For that, we developed a series of stimuli, 3 familiar and 3 unfamiliar sweet test foods, which varied in sweetness at 5 different levels, from very low sweetness to very high sweetness. And we use ranking on a scale method to evaluate the liking. We use unfamiliar foods because familiarity is a strong determinant of preference. And as a control measure, we also included salty foods with it varied in saltiness intensity. Currently, we are about 2/3 of the trial. It's a long-term study where we studied in the middle of the COVID pandemic, but we could go on with the study. And currently we now have 143 participants enrolled out of the 180. And I hope that this autumn we have the whole study, the recruitment completed, and we will collect the last data set at August 2024. So I hope in the autumn of 2024, so about next year, that we will get the main results of the study. And looking forward to that because it's like a run, it's like a marathon, this study, but it's fun to do. We not only have sweetness preferences, we also have sweet taste intensities, we have sweet liker type, we have food cravings. We also measure glucose metabolism and biomarkers related to cardiovascular diseases and diabetes. So I think overall we have a huge data set which will give an answer to, I would say, a pretty simple question. I think we started with this idea about 8 years ago. So it takes you about 10 years to answer that simple question, which everybody believes is true. But yeah, we'll see what comes out. To illustrate some of the effects on sweetness, on liking, and also repeated exposure to sweetness on liking, I've also made a movie, and some of you may be familiar to that. But in that movie, you can see the two conditions. One, 2 kilograms of grape juice, which we divided, 2 kilograms of grapes, which we divided into 1 kilogram of grape juice and 1 kilogram of grapes. And the main point of the video, well, you will see it, but you see a huge difference in sweetness exposure, but also a huge difference in, I would say, emotional response. There's no sound to the video, but it's furthermore, it's clear enough, I would say. Takes 1 minute. So after 90 seconds, he's finished with the kilogram of grape juice. But it takes him about 20 minutes, so about 10 times as long to consume the same amount of grapes. So the exposure to taste that he has is about 10 times as high with the grapes as with the grape juice. So, and I think in the grapes, the taste system does what it needs to do. It senses the nutrients in foods, and it causes satiety. And with the grape juice, it's like you ingest the liquid, but you don't sense the sweetness and you don't sense the calories. I think we know a lot about sweetness and obesity and liking, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I would really hope that, for instance, in relation to NHANES, that in the US, you could develop a database like this and study the relationship between sweet taste exposure to body weight and energy intake. Another way of progress is, I think, to calculate sweetness and taste exposures in various ways and relate that also to nutrition and health outcomes. We now calculated sweetness exposure as a contribution to the energy intake, but you can also express it in many other ways. And I think furthermore, we need to carry out more controlled, excellent nutrition intervention studies on these questions. You can do that on sweetness, but of course also on things like saltiness and other related health outcomes. So thank you very much for your attention, and you can see a link to the iSense or the Sweet Tooth study in at the link, and then you can look at it. And for me, sweetness is really pleasant, so, and that's also visible in the girl consuming that ice cream. So we should keep that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kees, for your presentation. We'll ask that all of the presenters come back on, and I will Excuse me 1 second. Back here. Give me 1 second. All right. So we have a few questions that have come in. Let's go with the first question. And this question is for Kelly. Excuse me. Is the total dietary sweetness outcome, what was the variance around the sweetness measure? And then the second question, is it possible that individuals with weight problems are already reducing sweet food intake, thus explaining the lack of association?
Yeah, so I'll first address the second part of that question. So individuals with a weight problem, are they potentially reducing their sugar intake? Absolutely. A lot of the evidence that I showed is from cross-sectional studies where you can't determine causality. It could potentially be reverse causality in that those individuals with a weight issue are reducing their sweetness exposure, which further emphasizes the need for conducting long-term clinical trials to look at this relationship in more detail. Another thing is in cross-sectional studies, there tends to be a systematic underreporting among individuals with overweight or obese. So if foods that are sweet that tend to be considered some of these problematic foods, people might not report those in a dietary recall. So there are definitely some quality issues with some of these cross-sectional studies regarding any sort of causal relationship between sweetness exposure and body weight. So we need more clinical trials to answer that question. The first part of the question is related to the variance in the total dietary sweetness measure. That varies based on the study, but Case has a much better idea because he developed some of those taste databases.
Yeah, well,
so go ahead, Case.
Yeah, I can answer that question. What we see is indeed that for a normal population, the dietary sweetness exposure in the Netherlands, and I think it's more or less similar in the US, is about 25 to 30 of the energy percentage coming from sweet tasting foods. We also looked at in the population of Dutch people, and then you see also quite a group of people who consume, say, between 40 and 50% of their energy from sweet tasting foods. And you also have a section of people who consume much less sweet tasting foods. So that's also in the sweet tooth trial, we have the high sweetness exposure, which is about 40 to 45% coming from sweet tasting foods. But there are quite a number of people who consume that diet on a regular basis. So the variation in a population is also kind of normal, with an average of about 25 to 30.
Okay.
Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Yes, I think that does. There's another question for you, Case. Could the increased weight from high salt, fat, umami foods versus sweet foods be due to the popularity of high protein diets, along with the general avoidance of sweet foods by people who are constantly fighting excess weight, as well as the availability of artificial sweeteners because no such substitutes exist for fat umami? That was a lot.
That's a number of questions in one. My primary hypothesis for this salty, fatty, umami tasting foods is that these are probably, there's a large section of high energy dense soft foods which you can consume quickly. And when we looked at eating rates of these foods in the Netherlands, and then you get typical products like a sausage roll or a hamburger, and these are consumed at a very fast rate. And I think I seek the explanation in that direction. I don't think there's a difference in protein intake between the obese and non-obese and the normal weight group. Yeah, and with respect to artificial sweeteners, I think, well, there's a huge amount of evidence that from randomized clinical trials that low energy sweeteners do what they are supposed to do. They lower energy intake. So.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And this question comes in, and thank you both for your talk, and it's clear there's more work to be done, but can you say a few words on the justification for a focus on reducing sweetness in the diet? Is there an alternate message that is better supported by the evidence, or do we need to wait for the outcomes of the trial that you are doing, Case?
Well, to me, it's the whole focus on sweetness and reducing sweetness. To me, there also seems to be a kind of moral inclination in that discussion that you shouldn't eat too much sweets because it's so good. So I think there's a high degree of Calvinism in that idea, whereas the evidence is actually lacking. Of course, and like Kelly showed, babies like sweetness and adults like sweetness and people across the world like sweetness, but why you should take that away, I think I see no rationale for that.
Okay, and then
Yeah,
go ahead,
Kelly.
Kelly.
The one thing I would, yeah, my one contribution for this would be, so some of this work on sweetness is based off work that was investigated saltiness. So if you reduce the amount of salt in your diet, you can reduce the preference for some of these salty foods. Some of that evidence informed the FDA's voluntary guidance to reduce the amount of sodium in the food supply, and that people would end up adapting to that reduced salt over time, which can help with various health outcomes. So we want to know if the same holds for added sugars. So if you reduce added sugars, do individuals become adapting to that reduced sugar diet over time, which can have various health benefits. But it's important to investigate whether it's the sugar or the sweetness, which I think quite a few of these studies are investigating a little further. So it makes it so, should the FDA make voluntary guidance based on added sugars? Because we think that people would end up preferring lower sugar diets over time.
Thank you very much. So we are out of time. There was a lot of engagement with the questions, but we don't really have time to address any more. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in this area. So our attendees for sure will be keeping an eye out for all the future work that's coming out in this area. For now, I'd like to thank both of our speakers. I'd also like to encourage attendees to connect with IFINS and visit us as we connect, collaborate, and catalyze science that matters. Please join our community. You can visit our website, stay connected with us on LinkedIn, and of course, email us directly with any additional questions you may have, and I'll work with the presenters to get those answered. So thank you very much for your time today, and keep an eye out for your certificate for those that are interested in that. Have a great day.